go ahead and get started. I am pleased this evening to introduce you to Matt Soliday. Matt is a CRNA who works primarily in pediatrics at Johns Hopkins, and he has a passion for helping students understand personal finance and budgeting and loans and all that stuff. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Matt and let him share his wisdom with you guys.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Katie. And thanks again for speaking with me last month so we could discuss this opportunity. Let me first start sharing my screen, and then I'll be able to get started. So, okay. Throughout the presentation, you have the chat function available to you. I encourage you to do that. I'm trying to simplify my screen so it's not distracting. There we go. At any point you have any questions or comments, please feel free to enter them into the chat or write them down on a sheet of paper. There should be ample opportunity to answer any of your questions or address any of those things. So we're gonna get right in. Move on to the next one. So my name is Matt Soliday. I've been a nurse anesthetist since 2011. I began my nursing career in 2006 as an ICU nurse. I finished CRNA school in 2011. And as time has gone along, I've done more and more peds anesthesia. The last 3 to 4 years, I've been solely a pediatric CRNA. When I got out of grad school, I had 6 figures in school loans. I was working a ton of overtime to pay it off. My wife and I had reached this very busy, important time of our life. We were newly married, saving up for a house and kind of planning our financial future together. You know, we made the decision together that we wanted to make sure we were going to be successful financially. So I began to learn everything I could about money. It was quite the passion. I was very excitable about everything I learned. I wanted to share it with other people. The joke would be, I would be sitting in the lunchroom and someone would say, "Hey, Matt, what are you eating for lunch?" And my response would be, a turkey sandwich. It's great. You know what else is great? Saving for retirement. I say that in kind of a funny way, but it's something that I was very excited to share with other people. And I got the opportunity at my workplace to give a presentation on personal finance. You think that it's one of those sort of taboo subjects where you can't speak openly about it. But what I realized is people really wanted to learn more because people want to make sure that their life kind of goes according to plan, especially financially. And even though money is a very important part of my focus on financial education, it doesn't mean that it's everything. It certainly doesn't mean it's the most important thing. All of our lives are going to be different and they're going to change. But this led me to my website and writing articles for Scrubs Money Life. And since this is so well received, I started giving presentations throughout the country. So I'm going to read this word for word. What does personal finance have to do with being a nurse? As nurses, we focus our careers on taking care of others. We help our patients with their physical and mental health every day, and we perform our jobs with an acute attention to detail. But when we walk out of those hospital doors, we might not always show that same level of care and attention to detail in other aspects of our life, like our financial health. So this is mostly me sharing with others all the things I wish I learned earlier on in my career. Also, I like to include a little bit of a disclaimer here. I am not a financial advisor. I'm not a professional money manager. I am not here to sell you life insurance or to manage your money. I'm just a fellow nurse, and I know many of you are nurses, and many of you are just about to become nurses for the first time. Just trying to do my part in sharing with you guys earlier in your career. I've broken this presentation up into a couple parts. The first part is going to be school loans. Anybody who has a school loan, it's in the forefront of their mind. It's find a job and pass boards. And what am I going to do with my school loans? I'm going to address that. And we're going to talk about budgeting for a new grad RN. Some on this call may be an advanced practice nurse or going through graduate school. The idea is the same. We're going to talk about investing principles, as well as some really big picture stuff like retirement versus financial independence. Okay, school loans. It's going to end up starting with something that's called the debt to income ratio. It's very easy to calculate and very important to calculate. You'll be able to easily do it within the next 2 slides. We're going to talk about debt elimination strategies. and also how to improve your ratio. The debt to income ratio, what it puts into context is your amount of debt into the context of your income. Without comparing these two things, it's hard to really know what's going on. So a simple example, average nurse and RN in the country makes about $70,000. Let's say if an RN owed $70,000 and they expected their income to be $70,000 when they finished. That means their debt to income ratio would be 1. In this next example, let's say someone borrowed even more for the same income. Their debt to income ratio would be 1.5. Now, what do we do with the ratio? So since everybody on this call is currently in school, you probably have an idea of what your debt is going to be. Simply take out a calculator if the numbers aren't as easy and pretty as this, and just perform the calculation. Because the next thing we'll do is come up with recommendations. If your debt to income ratio is less than 1.25, most people would benefit from refinancing their loans and paying it off at an accelerated rate. My debt to income ratio was 1, and I'll get to that in a moment. If your ratio, however, is on the higher side, and I consider that threshold to be greater than 1.5, meaning if you look at your income, you owe 50% greater than what your total income is. And this is a pre-tax calculation. Most students would benefit significantly from seriously considering loan forgiveness and grant programs, along with income-driven repayment options. So this is a lot of words, and this is actually a recent addition that I added because for some of you, this is going to be incredibly important. And for some of you that it's not, you'll just bear with me, please. So when you have a very high debt to income ratio, and when you do it, it's greater than 1.5, your monthly student loan payment will be significant. For some people, it'll be as high as your rent. It's like an extra rent payment. And so in order to better create a budget and not feel too squeezed, have a more reliable way of eliminating your debt, enrolling in something called an income-driven repayment plan is worth consideration. The federal government, what they do with these plans is they'll end up recalculating your monthly payment based on a percentage of your discretionary income. This is influenced by what your income is, what location in the country, and also your family size. For many people with high ratios, you could reduce your monthly payment by as much as 50%. Now that sounds incredible because that sounds like everybody wants to do this. However, it's specifically designed to benefit the people with a high ratio the most, who are pursuing loan forgiveness and grants. The two most common IDRs, we'll call it, are called pay and repay. If you're not participating in this is a lot of wasted words, but if you are participating in this is absolutely essential. It's ideal for those high ratios and pursuing those grants. It allows you to essentially pay as little as possible while working for a qualifying employer. Depending on the program that you're enrolled in or you're pursuing, this could be a critical shortage or critical access facility. This could be a 501c3 or nonprofit. This could be on a reservation or a government facility. There are many employers that qualify for these government programs. Now, the one sort of caveat or danger in which not everyone, should be jumping at this is because one of the reasons that they can reduce this to such a lower monthly payment is because they changed the length of the loan from 10 years to 20 to 25 years. So yes, it gives you like breathing room on your cash flow, but if you don't have a plan to eliminate that debt, you're going to be paying that debt for 20 to 25 years, which is why I highly recommend that almost any person considering income-driven repayment plans should pursue forgiveness. And that way, over the 2, 3, or 10 years, depending on the program, you pay as little as possible, and you'll try to maximize the amount of loans that are going to be forgiven. And more specifically, of course, the biggest student loan forgiveness program in the country gets a lot of media attention. You probably already have heard about it or done your own research. It's called public service loan forgiveness. It's pretty straightforward to qualify. Some other programs can be a little bit more difficult. However, a lot of the stuff in the news has been the documentation and proof of your qualifying payments has been a little challenging. And I believe the government's working on making that more straightforward. The way it works is you enroll in an income-driven repayment plan like pay or repay, like the previous slide, and you make 120 qualifying monthly payments, which is equivalent to monthly payments for 10 years, while working for a nonprofit or the equivalent. You'll be eligible for forgiveness for all the remaining loan at the time that you've reached 120 qualifying payments. There's paperwork that you must do every year. It can seem like a headache, but the amount of money that they can pay off for you is significant. It is worth the effort. Now, aside from that, very nursing and healthcare specific, through HRSA, the Health Resources and Service Administration, they have some other programs you're gonna hear a lot of people talk about. I've known a number of nurses in my hospital in Baltimore who pursued and received the Nurse Corps Loan Repayment Program. They can forgive or pay off up to 85% of your loans in the first 3 years, and that's typically where it stops, but you have to apply and get approved. In contrast to something like PSLF, all you have to do is meet the criteria and anyone can participate, provided their loans are unrefinanced and they're federal. Any non-federal private loans or refinanced loans don't qualify for most of these things. Now, the HRSA website I find to be incredibly useful. So you can look at HRSA grant and loan forgiveness or loan repayment. And I found their website to be helpful because you need to make sure you properly identify the institution or the workplace in which the service can be exchanged for that program. I actually have a colleague who's pursuing both of these simultaneously because the hospital is a nonprofit and a critical shortage facility. Now, I of course can address more questions about that later. So you can improve your ratio. Now in school, the key is try not to overborrow or overspend. You know, I did buy a flat screen television during grad school. Yeah, I ended up paying interest on it. It was worth it because I didn't do that very much, but that's kind of the idea. Most of us are only going to borrow what we need. We're going to get through school, and then what do we do about it? In order to improve your ratio, which improves the circumstance, you could consider increasing your income by making more money. It sounds simple, right? But there's a lot of things to consider because money is not the only consideration for your career. You could accept a job that's paying higher, depending on your ratio and what your financial goals are. Consider working overtime, high needs, 1099. But the key is, if you're really pushing to earn more, it's important to not burn out because a short-term gain is not worth detriment to your career and your ability to earn income in the future. Personally, my debt-to-income ratio was 1 when I graduated. I owed the same amount that I earned. I worked overtime consistently for 7 years, essentially artificially increasing my salary. So I got to pay my loans off. I did that within 5 years. And then I could pay cash for major life events like engagement and getting married, home renovations, things like that. So school loans, we're gonna set that aside. We can always address more of that later. And now we're gonna go to everyone's not favorite word, budget. A lot of people get very hesitant and they don't feel very positive whenever they hear this word because they're worried that it's gonna involve sacrifice or deprivation. But it's not true because we're all talking about a budget that works for us, the individual, the budget that would work for you. And when it comes to a budget, what it really is, it's a framework for making decisions about your money to reach your goals. And if you're going to have goals, they're going to be closely tied to your priorities, and that's the way a budget should be built. And I'll show you. I'm going to talk about the role of fixed costs and how they influence all of this. We're also going to talk about the impact of lifestyle. And now, if we're going to talk about a priorities budget, it is all about your priorities, not your cousins or your colleagues or your neighbor. It's about yours and the people in your life that matter the most. And as life changes, you change your budget because your priorities will change. Now, the way that I've seen it is if you speak to a lot of people who aren't being very mindful about their money, is that I feel as though their budget or lack thereof is really upside down. They focus on a lot of the feel-good stuff, a lot of the lifestyle stuff, the stuff they enjoy immediately, and I can't blame them. It's fun. But the problem when you sort of prioritize your lifestyle and your spending or the car that you're driving or your vacation or where you're living is when you focus on that, you're going to realize there's not much money left over at the end of the month. And it essentially is showing that someone's priorities are upside down. There's very little money to make progress towards their financial goals, like paying off their loans or saving up for a house or saving for retirement. The proper way to do a budget, I would say, is by prioritizing the things in your life that you have decided are most important to you. If you really want to be out of debt in 2 years, and that's a reasonable expectation, and you want to be retired comfortably by 58, great. Your financial plan and your decisions with money should reflect that. So that's the idea. If you automatically set aside money to those biggest financial goals, and then those other things can just fall into place on the rest. Now I'm going to throw some numbers here. Fixed costs are incredibly important when it comes to a budget. The higher your fixed costs are, the less breathing room you have. Things get squeezed. So recurring costs, everyone I've ever met has to pay for housing in some way or another. When it comes to what your post-graduation income is going to be, sort of a nice rule of thumb is if your total housing payment every month is less than 30% of your take-home pay. If you make a lot of money, you can afford a bigger house. If you don't make very much money, you need to be more careful, and it needs to be tied to what your income is. If you don't have a car and you need to acquire one so you can get to work, and you have to take out a loan because you don't have the cash saved up, your car payment should be less than 10% of your take-home pay. So let's just apply this to some real numbers. Let's say you're a new grad RN and you're expecting $1,800 every 2 weeks in your paycheck, which is $3,600 a month. By applying this 30% for housing, that would say $1,080. And for a car payment, it would say it should be less than $360. Now, for this example, I just kind of threw in a number of a pretty decent amount of student loans with a monthly payment of $742. Now, if we just plugged all of these in, starting with $3,600 for the month, this would say the rest of life, you have $1,400, essentially $1,400 to live on the rest of it and to accomplish whatever your goals are. And one key thing to remember, what about retirement account contributions? When your budget and your student loans are staring you at the face, sometimes it can take some time. Sometimes it can take years. But one thing to keep in mind, you should always contribute enough to get your full employer match, regardless of your debt to income ratio and your debt elimination plan, or even if you don't have debts. It should be 4% is the most common matching for a 401k. When able, if you're pursuing an income-driven repayment plan, you're no longer paying extra because you're paying the minimum in order to get forgiveness, or you've paid off your loans. Getting to 15% into your retirement accounts as soon as possible will set you up for success, and I'll show some more examples of that. This is just an example. Let's say your debt to income ratio is less than 1.25. You owe an amount similar to the amount that you expect to earn. Then it's very important to find out what your monthly payment amount is going to be. This is just a screenshot of a calculator on my site for debt payoff calculator. It can be used for anything outside of credit cards. In this example, I just plugged in $50,000 as the starting amount, let's say a $50,000 school loans, and the term length, 120 months, which is 10 years. Right underneath the summary, it'll say monthly payment amount. So if you're not sure what your monthly payment is going to be, it's very difficult to kind of build your budget around and sort of structure the rest of your spending. Now, for some people, they prefer the detailed bit by bit, instead of a priorities budget where you just plan the biggest, most important things. Some people feel like writing everything down. This is just the Excel spreadsheet way. I created this as sort of a nice little exercise for those who want to kind of break it down and keep it, I guess, privately, locally on their computer instead of doing like an app. But there's a lot of apps out there where you can sync your accounts if you're comfortable with that. Now, this one's slightly on the fun side, especially scenario A. I'm going to compare two scenarios, and you just picture yourself in these scenarios. Now, scenario one is going to represent high fixed costs. In this triangle example of a budget, this is the upside down one. This is the place where, okay, I'm going to borrow as much money as I can for, yes, this house looks ridiculously expensive. That's the idea of this example. And that's a very nice BMW. And so this is more focused on the lifestyle spending and the feel-good stuff. The challenge is, unless you make millions of dollars, this can be very difficult to sustain. When your fixed costs are high, you have a very small portion of your income available to making true financial progress, to accumulating assets, accumulating and increasing your net worth or paying off your school loans. And that pile of money there might seem like a nice bit of cash to have someone's pocket. But in this example, it represents the fact that you don't have that much money in your retirement accounts because you've spent it all. Let's contrast that to something a little bit more realistic. a more low fixed cost scenario. You finished your training, either undergraduate or graduate, at Emory for nursing. And when you come out, you're more careful. Your triangle is the correct way up. You've identified how you're going to eliminate your school loans. You've had a budget, your fixed costs aren't too high. This allows you to have much beefier retirement accounts. You pay off your debts quickly, and you're going to have the choice of comfortable retirement when you decide to end your career. This little picture on the bottom right, which is a much larger amount of cash, represents those very beefy retirement accounts. And when it comes to accumulating wealth, especially with investing, well, we should probably talk about investing. The key is, when it comes to investing, there's all kinds of opinions and strategies and preferences, but you need to invest enough money to reach your goals. As an example, saving $10 a day probably won't get a nurse to their goals because her income is so much higher than that. Your savings rate is key. And I alluded to it earlier when I recommended saving 15%, which for some may seem extreme, but I promise it's not. We're going to talk about time in the market, specifically the stock market, not timing the market. Talk about asset allocation and diversification, and compound interest. So here's the savings rate concept. It's the most important in all of personal finance. It has a greater direct impact on your ability to accumulate wealth than any concept, regardless of your income level. It's directly related to how long it'll take you to pay off your school loans, save up for an emergency fund, or achieve something huge like financial independence and a comfortable retirement. The key is, there's so much variation in how people choose to handle their money and how they approach their goals. But the reality is, a savings rate dollar increases your net worth, and there's two ways of doing it: by adding assets or reducing debts. So this one's, what's nice is I'm kind of engaged for you to answer in your own head or on your muted microphone, but here's a simple question. Even if you don't know much about investing, just give it a shot to yourself. Do you think it's more likely that the stock market will be higher 30 days from now, or the stock market will be higher 30 years from now? Let's take a little look. So this represents about an 8-month time frame. I guess this is 2011 of the S&P 500, which is the most commonly referenced stock market index. It's the 500 largest publicly traded companies in the US stock exchange. So Apple and Amazon and Ford, they're all on there, okay? They use it as a surrogate to represent the overall performance of the stock market, because where the 500 biggest companies go in terms of price, typically the whole market goes as well. If you began investing at the beginning of this graph and you look to the right, not only is the color red, which doesn't feel good, and it's going down, you'd feel pretty anxious. But if you knew that it's important to zoom out and step back, you realize you're investing for the long term. And when you take a look at that little red square, that represents that little 8-month time frame. This is starting to show the ups and downs and the frequent perturbations of the stock market, and all the news is largely completely irrelevant for most investors, and that means every single one of you. If you look at the stock market, this is for 100 years, it's averaged 8 to 10%, and over long periods in time, it has reliably gone up. Now, that doesn't mean over the next 6 months or 2 years it's going to go up, but the history has shown that it has, as companies and institutions and governments, and as things progress, prices rise, and our world continues on. Now, the analogy that I like for this one is, you can't see the forest through the trees. To the left are the trees, but if you realize that in order to accomplish long-term financial goals, you just need to stay invested for the long term. Trying to time things or choose the next big stock or crypto is not a reliable way of giving yourself a very good chance at success. Of course, there's more than just investing for a long period. A little sort of touch on this. If anybody has specific questions on this, I can ask, but this part is kind of the thicker part, let's say. So when you hear the term asset classes, these are things that are worth money, and we invest in them because we hope they produce an income or increase in value. The most common ones are stocks, bonds, real estate, or owning your own business. The majority of accumulated wealth occurs in people's retirement accounts, which are primarily in the stock market. but also the equity in their homes that they build over time. Now, when it comes to diversification, you can diversify within a class of stocks or also between asset classes. The easiest way that all of us enjoy stock diversification without even really having to make a decision is through an employer-sponsored retirement account. It's very common for them to have something called target date funds. As an example, the one bank or financial institution that's running the program for your institution, it could be called Life Cycle 2050 if you expect to retire by then. It'll automatically change the allocation. So you go from really heavy in stocks in the beginning to increasing bonds and cash a little bit closer to be a little bit more conservative. Now, this I'm going to zoom through. This is representing the change in asset allocation over time. The blue part represents a smaller amount in the beginning of your career in your 20s to 30s. And that represents the amount that are bonds, which are thought of as a lower return, but less volatile and less risky. They're primarily there to insulate you from the fact that stocks are usually much more volatile than bonds. As time goes along, your exposure or portion of your portfolio that stocks will go down. You still need it though, and bonds will go up. And that's what happens the closer you get to retirement. Now, compound interest is one of my favorite things to talk about. It really requires two things to be successful, but it's really what's responsible for this magical sort of explosion of wealth that occurs over the decades. It's hard to believe it when you're early on and starting to invest and accumulate a net worth. But over time, this thing is responsible for helping you reach your long-term financial goals. To get there, you need two things. The first is time. If we simply invested $5,000 and left it alone in the stock market, and it performed the way many people expect, which is approximately an 8% return, after 30 years, it'd be over $50,000, right? That's a tenfold increase. And that's because of how long it was invested. Now, if we compare that to the other thing that's necessary for compound interest, we talk about rate of return. Now, I already mentioned 8% is a historical benchmark. And if you look at these lines, we all want to be at, near, or around that green line. It's pretty obvious. And the key shows you that's an 8% rate of return. What if you're getting into bonds and savings accounts and just low yield investments? You would never get to see compound interest. Accumulating wealth doesn't occur in these conservative sort of investment vehicles. Yes, they're valuable, but early on, they have very little value because exposure to a higher rate of return is what's necessary. So let's start throwing real numbers. Another analogy that we could use for this is called the snowball effect. You think of a snowball rolling down the hill. The bigger the snowball is, the steeper the hill, or the longer it rolls, the more it accumulates, the more snow. And it's the same idea behind investing. If you, let's say, invested $200 a month, after 30 years, 280 grand. So let's say you did $400 a month, which for most nurses, that's pretty straightforward. $800 a month represents doing half the maxed out retirement account. Okay, that's $400 a paycheck. It'd be $1.1 million after 30 years. What if you maxed out a retirement account? That's one person maxing out a retirement account based on the current maximum being $19,500 if you're less than 50 years of age, which I'm assuming most of you are. $2.2 million. It's true. So perhaps I'm just a huge money nerd, but the first time I used a compound interest calculator, I honestly believe changed my life. If you've never used one, I highly encourage you use one. Use any calculator you want. I had a very good one built for my site, but I won't take it personally if you use another one. This just shows a screenshot. Let's say you started with $25,000 or even $1, depending where you are in your career. You started saving for 30 years. And for this example, someone who maxed out a retirement account and starting with 25 grand, they'd end up with $2.5 million, which, believe me, it's not as excessive as it sounds, because I mean, that's what financial security looks like, right? So now let's go even bigger picture. And this is the final part of my presentation. Retirement versus financial independence. This is like, you know, kind of what the dreams are made of. Now, retirement is simultaneously my favorite and my least favorite word in personal finance. The reason it's my favorite word is just uttering the word around many people results in a very honest response from them. It's just, I wish it was always positive, but very often it's not. They take a deep breath, they look down at the ground, they comment, oh man, that's not happening for me. Or sometimes they're like, man, I can't wait. I love how honest the response is. And I find it usually leads to a very meaningful conversation, especially if I care. It could be my colleagues, my family member, or my friends. Now, on the flip side, the reason simultaneously my least favorite word in personal finance is because it means different things to different people. Because who cares about what I want my retirement to look like if you want yours to look like this and your friend wants theirs to look like this? Well, it's their retirement, so it's up to them, right? Now, the one thing why I prefer financial independence as a term is because you can't really be debated. Yes, you can live your life any way you want, but the financial circumstance, that's the key. It's the circumstance in which you could retire if you wanted. You know, if each of us were given $10 million right now, would we never work a day in our life again? What would our retirement look like? I know I would stop working. I would just maybe change how often I work. So this is going to move on to, let's start putting these sort of dreams into real numbers. There's something referred to as the 4% rule. It's not necessarily a rule, but it's more like a guiding light. There was a research study called the Trinity study, which is often referenced. And what they did was they looked at the performance of portfolios based on different allocations of stocks and bonds. And the question was, how much could you withdraw or spend from the portfolio every single year and still have a high likelihood you still have money at the end of 30 years? This 30 years represents retirement or the end of your life. And they found that a 4% withdrawal every single year, regardless of how much is in the account, results in a high likelihood of still having money left over. Now, when we think about that, like if you could live off of 4% of $100,000, then a 4% withdrawal, it should sustain you for retirement. But we know that $100,000 is not enough for retirement. Now, when you think of 4%, it's essentially 1/25. It's the way a lot of people think of it. They think of 25 years of expenses. As an example, if you want to withdraw $4,000 a month during retirement, that'd be $48,000 a year. Multiply that by 25 and you'll see your goal portfolio size is $1.2 million. Now, if I started the presentation with showing everyone, if you just want to spend $4,000 a month, you're going to need 1.2 million. You're going to think I'm absolutely bananas. But showing you this compound interest and investing over the long term, it's actually quite reasonable. Now, savings rate, I've mentioned it a couple times already, and I'm going to show again why that sort of 15% is a very reasonable to start. Because what a lot of people, they work their whole career to get up there, oh, I'm going 1% per year. But that might not reach their goals, right? Inside the green box, you'll see the 10% column, and it's in blue. Based off some basic assumptions on the balance of saving versus spending, it shows that for 10% savings rate, it'll take you about 48 years to achieve financial independence based on the most popular assumptions of how to calculate this. If you change your savings rate by 10%, you could knock 13 years off of that. Now, the challenges of living our life and having lifestyle and comfort needs and so many things that we can't anticipate, it's difficult to necessarily promise 20% of your income because life changes so often. But this is the power of that, right? The greater the portion that's going towards saving and accumulating means you're spending less. So you're going to end up needing less and you accumulate more. If I lost any of you on that, I'm happy to clarify, of course. So that's why I write traditional advice is wrong. Saving 10% is not enough. That's the biggest danger with saving 10% towards retirement. The danger is being comfortable with saving 10%, because a lot of time it takes mindfulness and some pretty big goals. Now, that is me stuffing as much personal finance knowledge right in front of you as I could in this amount of time. Hopefully your brains aren't exploding, because if you haven't really dived deep into investing, it can be a little bit much at first. So here's the key. Making financial progress towards your goals allows you to enjoy immediate benefits. You've made a significant investment in your career by choosing to go to Emory, and it is going to pay off. But the key is identifying how you're going to eliminate the loans if you have them. And it allows you to have less stress about money. When you stress less about money and you know you're on path, regardless of what your ratio is or grants or whatever it is, maybe you're working overtime and paying extra, knowing that you're on track to reach those goals, it allows you to get more enjoyment out of work, the reason why you got into this career to begin with. And that'll also give you more enjoyment out of life, with less things getting in the way. That's been a ton of stuff. I realize it. I would love to answer any of your questions. I hope you guys found this useful. And yeah, hopefully there's some questions. Trying to fix my screen.
Have questions, if you'll either ask them audibly or type them into the chat, we'll make sure that Matt is able to address those for you.
Yeah. And for, I've noticed for some schools, a lot of people are more, they spend a lot of time mulling it over. And a lot of time what this will end up doing is essentially planting the seed. Because when I finished nursing school in 2006, I wasn't learning about investing. And even when I finished in 2011 from grad school, I knew I didn't want my loans to be around forever. But this is like a really good primer because there's a lot of steps in life that require us to be in the right place and the right mindset. And this certainly won't hurt, I promise that. Did someone raise their hand?
Did you wait to pay off your loans before you bought a house, or did you take on more debt when you still had a significant debt burden?
I'll tell you what I did, and then if you want me to address any different examples, happy to. I graduated in 2011. I had, my debt to income ratio was 1. My wife and I had not met yet. We got married 4 years later in 2015. And a year after, let's see, I graduated in 2011, 2016, my loans were paid off. A year after we got married. We didn't buy a house until the following year. So based on our relationship status, it kind of worked out perfectly because my loans were done. We were married. The engagement ring was already bought. The honeymoon was paid for. And now together we work towards the house down payment. I'm assuming you might be interested in what if you want to buy a house sooner and you have school loans.
Yeah, I mean, it's just if you look at rate or rent rates in Atlanta, I mean,
yep,
you should be paying, putting in that to equity in a house now. I mean, and that they seem to have no indication that they'll slow down. And so it's one of those things I'm kind of looking at. I'm going to have housing costs.
Yeah,
so I don't really plan to leave Atlanta.
Yeah,
so I feel pretty confident that I would stay here.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So depending on what part of the country that any of you end up in, the balance between rent and real estate prices varies greatly. Some places it pays to be a renter because it's astronomical to buy. In other places, rent is high. Then all of a sudden it's like, why am I paying so much in rent when that money could be going towards building equity in my home? So the answer isn't going to be the same for everybody, but the key is to avoid any of the big challenges here. Over borrowing on a house, as an example, let's say rent is really high. The key is not over borrow. I'd recommend twice household gross income, or if you're going to end up getting a mortgage, like I mentioned, less than 30% of your take home on your housing payment. Provided you've done that, it's very reasonable to buy a house. But the problem is if you end up stretching beyond that and you're paying more than 30% for housing and you have school loans, that's asking for a pretty big problem, because when you borrow hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's all well and good until risk happens, until maybe your income comes down, or all of a sudden there's another added lifestyle expense. My wife and I have had some pretty big financial bumps in the road through no fault of our own that have required significant amounts of cash that we weren't anticipating, and had nothing to do with buying cars or going on vacation, just important things in our life that required our money. We were very thankful that our housing payment is less than 25% of our take-home pay. Now, I understand when you're in a place like Atlanta or you're in a place like New York City, it gets a little bit more challenging. But as long as you're mindful of what the impact of how much you're borrowing is, what that fixed cost is going to do for you, and then how much is going towards your loans, it's good to game plan these things. And if you want to write out a couple examples specifically for you and your income and your school loans, this could prove to be helpful. But I would say one of my biggest pieces of advice is you need to have financial flexibility in your monthly budget. If your fixed costs are too high, you're very likely to run into a problem when you have a house because there's a lot of expenses associated with it. Now, the decision to rent versus buy is very personal, and it doesn't always come down to the dollars. However, I would say there's far greater risk of over borrowing or borrowing at the wrong time if you don't have enough leeway to save money every month. I hope that was helpful, without real numbers. I see a hand raised digitally by Maggie. Would you like?
Yeah. Hi, Matt. This was really helpful. Thank you so much. One of the questions I have, so this is my first nursing degree, and I plan to pursue higher education. But my question more is do you like to tell people to max out their 401k before putting money into a Roth IRA, or what's your kind of guidance there in terms of accounts?
I love, I always get a question about a Roth, and there's good reason, because you have a real decision to make. Now, I wrote an article parsing out the details between the two, but certainly I'll address them right now. Now, our savings rate is more important than anything. I'm definitely answering your question, I promise. I'm not sidestepping. The amount of money you put towards whichever one you choose is more predictive of how well you're going to do long-term financially. You put a lot of money in a 401k and a little bit of money in the Roth, or vice versa. Whichever one you put a lot of money into is going to win, okay? Now, the Roth account, I'm just going to explain the differences. 401k or 403b are used synonymously. It's where you can contribute to this account, and all the retirement accounts have one thing in common. They're taxed, advantaged, or privileged. There's tax advantages to these accounts. That's why they're so important to accumulate assets for retirement over the long term. All the retirement accounts accumulate and grow without taxation. But the other accounts, like the 401k, you put in money prior to taxation to let it grow tax-free, but it's taxed when you take it out. That's the most common way people prepare. The advantage for the Roth, you get taxed upfront at your current day tax rate, but it grows tax-free like the 401k, but it never gets taxed again. It's very valuable for many people. But now this brings into the question that's not always the most straightforward, the difference in tax rates. I'll explain the example of which the Roth IRA is best used. If you can directly contribute to a Roth IRA and you're going to earn less than you expect, significantly less than you expect to earn later in life, and you expect to accumulate a large amount of money, paying taxes today to contribute to the Roth so that you never have to pay taxes later is most valuable if you expect your tax rate in the future to be higher than today. This is like the textbook example of why when a Roth is so valuable. If your tax rates are the same, the answer is it doesn't really matter, because you're going to get taxed one way or the other at the same tax rate. Many people don't know, and no one knows what tax rates are going to be like. So you have to make some assumptions. If you're ever not sure, you can put money into both. But the portion of your income that gets split between the two is far more predictive. As an example, though, I'll give you the CRNA perspective. Because I'm fortunate enough to have a higher income, the tax deferral at my high tax bracket is highly valuable. My wife works full time. We are a joint household, and we file our taxes together. Because our household income is high, we both max out our 401ks. That tax deferral is so valuable for us because we're already at a high bracket. Now, if you're at a lower bracket, you can take advantage of both. It's hard to necessarily say everyone at this income should put this portion in a 401k. That being said, if I had to say what's more valuable, I would say a 401k for a very specific reason. You automate how much money you put in, and it never comes into your bank account. You can never accidentally spend it. That is incredibly valuable. Setting aside the money, paying yourself and your future first is highly valuable. If you reach your 401k contribution goals and you still have more money you want to contribute, then working in a Roth is totally reasonable. That being said, some people may even prioritize a Roth if you really feel strongly about it. And once you've maxed out your Roth at $6,000 per year, then they start ramping up the 401k to get to their goals. But like I said, it's hard to necessarily tell everybody what to do because that's not my place, but also there's so many different paths to success. Hopefully I didn't talk too much on that, but not everyone might be as knowledgeable about those accounts as you. Is that helpful?
No, yeah, that's great. Yeah, super helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Matt, it looks like you have a question in the chat box.
Okay, I'll look. I see from Rory, my talk about, yes. So even though money is like my favorite topic to give talks on, I am equally as passionate about career decisions, regardless of what field people specialize in. So when I finished nursing school, I got my BSN, I came out in 2006. I was fortunate enough as a nursing student to get a position as like my senior practicum or externship or whatever you call it in the medical ICU in Baltimore. That gave me a good exposure to the ICU. And when I was there and I started, they hired me as a new grad. I was very lucky. And during my time there, I quickly realized that most of my time was spent working. And what I mean by that is, I enjoyed rounds because we got to sit, take a moment, pause, and start to learn. And I really enjoyed that. And I realized I was still thirsty for knowledge. Once I finished my orientation, I felt comfortable in ICU. And I realized I wanted my job to change from working to learning. And that's why I realized I needed to go back to graduate school. I followed around acute care NPs because I like the critical aspect of like airway management, resuscitation. So I followed around 2 critical care NPs and 4 CRNAs, which is excessive, but I was pretty motivated. The shadow days were really the key for me, regardless of whether or not someone wants to become a CRNA, because the shadow days gave me a real sort of reflection and experience on learning exactly what the job was like. Even though I loved critical care, the role of the acute care NPs at 2 different hospitals, mind you, just didn't really gel with me. But every time I followed a CRNA, I loved it. So that was my path. I got to meet some really great CRNAs who were willing to let me follow them around and ask them a bunch of questions. Shadow days will change your career, right? Because the idea is if you're motivated and you choose the right specialty for you in your life, that's called success. So the key is that you're informed, regardless of whether or not you want to, deliver babies as a midwife, or you want to go work in an outpatient clinic as an FNP, or you want to do research at a school. The key is just making sure you're well informed. If you have something more specific about CRNA, I can be more specific, but that's what brought me to applying to school. And then I applied just before the 2-year mark, and at 2 years, 4 months after starting as new grad RN, I started CRNA school. Oh, cool. Hey, Shani Strader. That's cool. Thanks. And you're welcome to anybody else. Did you do a nurse residency? So nurse residency wasn't a thing when I finished. If I'm assuming what you mean by, could you perhaps inform me on the details of such a program? Is it unpaid or paid?
No, it's I've been looking at them right now. So basically for like a year or 2, you go through like about a 20-month program, and then that kind of counts towards like your orientation. And so you're like attending classes, but it's like almost like a softer glide path into nursing. And so that's one I've been kind of looking at, as opposed to just going 2 feet in.
Would you be paid as an RN during this program?
I've seen like some of the cons are like a slightly less rate, just because you're with a preceptor a good amount.
Yeah. So when I started in ICU, my orientation, I think, was 4 months, 6 months, where I had one-on-one an experienced ICU nurse training me every single day for 4 to 6 months. That's very costly to the unit and the department. But then the orientation stopped. If you were going to have a program that would orient you longer, my initial impression is if you've worked so hard to get through school, you should get to enjoy your full income, whatever your level of education, whether or not be BSN, MSN, DNP. I'd have a hard time accepting a lower rate of pay. I believe what's even more important, you could definitely do this. If this feels like the right fit for you, I would say do it, but I'm gonna speak in generalities. If you choose the right unit to start in, I don't think you need to accept a lower rate of pay to be in a particularly long program. You've already spent long enough focusing on building your education and focused on passing your boards. Once you do that, all you have to do is choose a unit that has a good orientation program for that unit. That being said, there could be some personal details, or maybe based on the institution that you're at, maybe they have details that specifically bring you from starting at the floor and it's a path to ICU, maybe a program like that. if you have more specific details you want to email me about, I'm happy to give more specific. But if I finish school, I would just want to work on the unit I'd want to work in that had a good orientation and a good culture that I would enjoy working at. Once you're experienced on that unit, you have ultimate flexibility of where to go with your career. I don't know about structure if it's not academic related. I hope that was helpful because I'm not too knowledgeable about that program, but if you feel as though it would be helpful for you, I feel like once you're on orientation for a couple months, wherever you end up choosing, you get to just be a nurse. I think the orientation really stops unless they specifically float you to multiple units to train all over the hospital. If they did that, maybe. But if it was in one area of the hospital, it seems a little funny to me. I'm not sure. No offense if that employer is listening. I'm just not sure about the program.
Harrison, I would encourage you to reach out to Andrew Plush in our Office of Enrollment and Student Affairs. He can kind of give you details of how it's being used in the Atlanta area. I think it's a kind of a regional setup, and it is a newer kind of concept in new nurse graduates. But go ahead, I would set up an appointment with him and he can kind of give you the benefits and the disadvantages.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to do some research as well. So that's the first time I've ever heard anybody ask a question about the nursing residency.
Well, guys, we've got a few minutes left. Are there any other personal finance questions for Matt that he can address for you guys tonight?
I do see one privately.
Okay.
I'm not going to, I can answer the question anonymously. I'm just reading it. Okay, this is someone talking about having a substantial amount of debt that they certainly look forward to eliminating one day, and what to do right now if they have the itch essentially to start saving or making financial progress. They did make one comment on things like penny stocks. I would say those are usually large waste of time because setting aside cash for your transition from school to passing boards and starting your life can incur a number of expenses, and having a little cash to the side, like at least several months of how much your life costs, I'd say is highly valuable. Outside of that, if you don't have earned income, it's hard to contribute to a Roth IRA. So it's true, if you're not earning income, you can't really contribute to a tax advantaged account, but you can participate in a brokerage account. There's many different outlets and financial institutions that do this. And I'm a big fan of index funds or exchange traded funds that have low costs and are widely diversified, such as the total stock market index or the S&P 500. Or if you're really into money, you could do large, mid, and small caps, but doing the very well diversified ETFs and index funds at a low expense is highly advantageous. But the key is, if you're going to invest money as a student in the stock market, it should only be done if the money is going to stay in there at least 5 years. If you think you need the money in the next couple of years, I would not put money in the stock market unless you're okay with that money going down in value. It's just too risky. To me, stock market is a long-term play. Feel free to email me if you need a more specific sort of answer, but that was my anonymous response. You're welcome. A person messaged me. Did Maggie just raise her hand again?
I think it's just been.
Oh, it's
yeah, I'm sorry. I can take that off. Thank you.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah.
All right. Well, Matt, thank you again so much. This was very valuable for all of us. And I look forward to passing it along to the students who weren't able to join us tonight. And again, I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, guys, for your time. I really enjoyed doing this.
All right.
Thank you,
everyone.
Bye, everybody.